The summers of my youth were measured not in days or weeks but in the endless hours that stretched from the first golden rays of dawn to the soft, glowing haze of twilight. They were eternal in the way that only childhood summers can be, filled with the kind of moments that seem ordinary at the time but grow luminous in memory. Sycamore Street, where I grew up, was the epicenter of these days, a stretch of modest homes and old trees where the rhythm of life was slow, steady, and perfect in its simplicity. The street itself was bordered by towering sycamores whose leaves whispered secrets whenever the wind stirred, their branches forming a canopy that shielded us from the harshest midday sun. The sidewalks were cracked and uneven, with tufts of grass poking through the gaps, but to me, they were runways, racetracks, and battlefields depending on the day's adventure. Our houses stood shoulder to shoulder, painted in the muted tones of the 1960s, soft yellows, blues, and whites, with porches that seemed to beg for long, lazy conversations. Each house had a story, but it was the spaces between them, the yards, the alleys, the shared laughter, that truly defined our world. In those days, my best friends were as constant as the summer sun. Jimmy O'Connor lived 3 houses down, a wiry kid with a freckled face and a grin that promised mischief. Tommy Franklin, whom we called Toad for reasons that were never clear, had an endless supply of scrapes on his knees and a knack for finding trouble. Susie Harper, no relation despite her last name, was smaller than the rest of us but made up for it with a fierce determination that often left the rest of us scrambling to keep up. Together, we ruled Sycamore Street, our exploits woven into the fabric of those long, sweltering days. The morning our summer truly began was like any other. The air was already heavy with heat, the sky a pale blue that seemed to hum with possibility. I woke to the sound of a lawnmower droning in the distance, its rhythm mingling with the chirping of birds outside my window. The smell of bacon wafted up from the kitchen, mingling with the earthy scent of freshly cut grass. It was a day that seemed ripe with promise, though I couldn't have guessed just how much it would deliver. After a quick breakfast, I bounded out the door, the screen slamming shut behind me in a way that would earn a stern word from my mother if she'd been close enough to hear. Jimmy was already waiting at the curb, perched on his bike with the restless energy of someone who'd been awake for hours. His bike was old and a little too small for him, its red paint chipped in places, but it was his pride and joy. He leaned forward as I approached, his grin widening. I grabbed my own bike from the side of the house, its tires still dusty from yesterday's ride, and the two of us set off, pedaling furiously down the street. There was no destination in mind, not yet. That was the beauty of those days, each one began as a blank slate, waiting to be filled with whatever the world decided to offer. The wind whipped through my hair as we sped past familiar houses, their porches empty in the early morning stillness. By the time we reached Toad's house, he was already out front, crouched over a collection of rocks he'd spread across the driveway. He claimed to be building a museum, though none of us were ever sure what kind of museum needed so many plain, dusty stones. He looked up as we approached, his face lighting up in a way that made it clear he'd been waiting for us. We didn't need to say anything, he simply hopped on his own bike, a beat-up relic with a lopsided seat, and fell in line. Our first stop was always the creek. It wasn't much more than a narrow ribbon of water that meandered through the woods at the edge of the neighborhood, but to us, it was a kingdom. The trees here were different from the ones lining Sycamore Street, wilder, with thick trunks and roots that twisted like sleeping snakes. The creek itself was shallow and clear, its bed scattered with smooth stones and the occasional darting minnow. It was the perfect place to skip rocks, catch frogs, or simply sit and let the cool water run over our hands. Susie joined us there, appearing from the shadows of the trees with her hair tied back and her cheeks flushed from the heat. She carried a stick she'd picked up along the way, waving it like a scepter as she made her way toward us. There was something about Susie, maybe the way she always seemed to know exactly where to find us, or the way she could turn even the most mundane object into something extraordinary, that made her seem larger than life, despite her small frame. Together, the four of us spent the morning exploring the woods, following the creek as it twisted and turned through the trees. The sunlight filtered down in patches, creating pools of golden light that seemed to shift and dance with every step we took. We stumbled upon a cluster of wildflowers growing along the bank, their petals a vivid splash of purple against the green. Toad, true to form, decided to dig up one of the flowers, claiming he'd add it to his museum. Susie stopped him with a sharp look that spoke volumes, and he grudgingly relented. As the sun climbed higher, we left the woods and made our way back to Sycamore Street, our legs scratched from brambles and our pockets filled with smooth stones and other treasures we deemed worth keeping. The heat of the day had settled in now, making the pavement almost too hot to touch. We parked our bikes in the shade of the sycamore tree at the end of the block, our unofficial meeting place, and sprawled on the grass. The rest of the day unfolded in the easy, unhurried way that only summer days can. We played stickball in the empty lot behind Jimmy's house, using an old broomstick for a bat and a tennis ball that was more patch than ball. When we grew tired of that, we sprawled under the shade of the tree again, sharing stories that grew wilder with each retelling. The hours slipped by unnoticed, marked only by the gradual shift of shadows and the distant chime of the ice cream truck making its rounds. As evening approached, the air cooled slightly, and the light softened into a warm, golden hue. We sat on the curb, our knees dusty and our faces streaked with sweat, watching as the streetlights flickered to life one by one. The fireflies came out then, their tiny lights blinking like stars brought down to earth. We chased them through the yards, our laughter ringing out in the gathering dusk. When the first call came from a parent's porch, Jimmy's mother, her voice carrying easily through the still air, we knew it was time to part ways. One by one, we peeled off, each of us heading home with the promise that we'd do it all again tomorrow. The screen door slammed behind me as I stepped into the cool, familiar comfort of home, my mother's voice scolding me faintly from the kitchen. That night, as I lay in bed, the sounds of the day still echoing in my mind, I felt the peculiar satisfaction that comes from knowing you've wrung every last drop of joy from the hours given to you. Outside, the fireflies still danced, their light a quiet reminder that the summer was only just beginning. The next day began much like the last, with the rising sun spilling golden light across Sycamore Street, painting the world in warm, familiar hues. The sound of a bird's chirping outside my window and the faint creak of the house settling in the cool morning air stirred me awake. The day stretched ahead like a canvas waiting to be filled, and I could already feel the quiet pull of adventure in the air. By the time I stepped outside, the heat was beginning to make its presence known, the kind that made the pavement hot enough to fry an egg and sent shimmers rising from the road. The air smelled of summer, freshly cut grass, the faint tang of tar from the street, and the sweet aroma of flowers from Mrs. Henderson's garden down the block. Jimmy was waiting under the sycamore tree, his bike leaning casually against the trunk as he surveyed the world with a calculating expression. It didn't take long for Toad and Susie to join us, the four of us drawn together like moths to a flame, each knowing instinctively where the others would be. There was a kind of unspoken rhythm to our days, a natural ebb and flow that seemed to guide our movements without need for words. We spent the morning riding our bikes in lazy loops around the neighborhood, the tires humming against the pavement as we wove in and out of each other's paths. It was mid-morning when Jimmy suggested we create something monumental. It wasn't so much an idea as it was a declaration, the kind of certainty only a kid can have. The thought of building something, of leaving a mark on the world, stirred an excitement in all of us. Chalk was gathered from various porches, the stubby, colorful sticks like treasure in our hands. We met back at the widest part of the street, where the pavement stretched out like a blank page, and began our work. The first strokes were tentative, the kind of hesitant lines that feel out the possibilities of what's to come. But soon, we fell into a rhythm, the chalk scraping against the pavement in bold, confident arcs. Jimmy took charge of the castle, his lines forming towers that stretched up into the imaginary sky. Susie created a village at its base, her houses small but intricate, each with its own character. Toad designed the forest, his trees jagged and wild, their branches reaching out like fingers. And I, with all the enthusiasm of a 10-year-old convinced of his own brilliance, sketched a dragon, its long, serpentine body curling around the castle walls. The sun climbed higher as we worked, its rays relentless but ignored. Our hands and knees became smudged with color, our fingertips stained with the remnants of our creation. The chalk dust clung to our clothes and skin, and we laughed at the way it made us look like we'd been caught in an explosion of rainbows. The street came alive under our hands, transformed into a kingdom that stretched as far as our imaginations would allow. It was a world of our own making, one where anything seemed possible. Mrs. Henderson passed by with her dog, pausing to admire our work with a smile and a nod of approval. The mailman, too, slowed his steps to take in the scene, his expression one of bemused curiosity. By the time we finished, the kingdom sprawled across the street, its borders marked by the limits of our endurance and the last bits of chalk left in our hands. We stood back, surveying our work with a mixture of pride and exhaustion, the kind that comes from knowing you've created something bigger than yourself. It wasn't enough to simply look at it, though. The kingdom demanded to be lived in, to be brought to life through play. Jimmy claimed the role of king, fashioning a crown from a scrap of newspaper he found in the gutter. Susie became the village mayor, her authority extending to the placement of imaginary market stalls and the allocation of non-existent goods. Toad was a knight, his sword a fallen branch he'd picked up along the way. And I, ever drawn to the fantastic, became the dragon, my role to terrorize and delight in equal measure. We played until the sun began its slow descent, the golden light softening the edges of the world. The dragon roared and chased, the knight defended valiantly, and the king ruled with a benevolent hand, all under the watchful eye of the mayor. The street echoed with our laughter, the sound mingling with the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of cicadas. As the first streetlight flickered on, casting a warm, amber glow over the kingdom, our parents' voices began to call us home. Reluctantly, we parted ways, leaving the chalk kingdom to fade into the shadows of the coming night. I walked home with the satisfaction of a day well spent, the kind that sinks into your bones and lingers like the smell of summer rain. The next morning, the kingdom was gone. A brief summer storm had passed through during the night, its rain washing the chalk away and leaving the street clean and new. It felt strange, seeing the blank pavement where our creation had once been, but there was something comforting in the knowledge that we could simply start again. And we did. Day after day, the street became a canvas for our imaginations, each new kingdom or map or design a testament to the boundless energy of our youth. There were treasure hunts plotted in chalk, intricate mazes that wound across the pavement, and battlefields where epic wars were waged with sticks and stones. Each creation was as fleeting as the summer itself, yet somehow more enduring than anything else I've ever known. It was during one of these afternoons, as we were sketching out a labyrinth that would stretch from one end of the street to the other, that something strange happened. I was crouched near the curb, drawing the twisting lines of the maze's entrance, when I noticed a shadow that didn't belong. It wasn't cast by the trees or the houses or any of us, but it moved, shifting slowly across the pavement. Looking up, I saw it, a low, dark shape darting across the far end of the street. At first, I thought it might be a stray dog, but it moved too quickly, its shape too undefined. I froze, my chalk poised above the pavement, watching as it disappeared around the corner. There was something about the way it moved that sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. The others noticed my hesitation and followed my gaze, their expressions shifting from curiosity to unease. We exchanged glances, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. Without a word, we abandoned our chalk and climbed onto our bikes, pedaling toward the corner where the shadow had disappeared. What we found there would change everything. The street beyond the corner felt different, even though it looked much the same as any other part of Sycamore Street. The houses here were older, their paint peeling in places and their porches sagging slightly with the weight of years. The trees, though still tall and leafy, cast shadows that seemed darker, their shapes sharper and more distinct. There was an unfamiliar stillness to the air, as if even the breeze had decided not to venture this far. We coasted to a stop at the corner, our bikes lined up like sentinels as we peered down the narrow alley that stretched between two of the houses. It was from here that the shadow had disappeared, its dark, undefined shape swallowed by the alley's gloom. The alley itself was unremarkable, just a strip of cracked concrete bordered by sagging fences and overgrown weeds, but there was something about it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The four of us stood there for a moment, our bikes forgotten, the air heavy with a silence that seemed to press against our ears. The world around us felt muted, as though we had crossed some invisible boundary into a place where time moved slower and sound struggled to carry. I felt the weight of expectation in that silence, the unspoken challenge to move forward. Without fully deciding to, I took a step into the alley, my sneakers crunching softly against the gravel. The others followed, their footsteps tentative but resolute. The farther we moved into the alley, the more it felt like stepping into another world. The houses seemed to lean in closer, their windows dark and watchful. The weeds whispered against the fence, their dry stalks brushing together like hushed voices. The alley ended abruptly at a chain-link fence, its rusted surface tangled with vines. Beyond it lay a stretch of woods, darker and denser than the ones we were used to exploring. These trees were older, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches forming a canopy so thick that only the faintest slivers of sunlight penetrated the gloom. It was from here that the shadow had come, I was certain of it. The fence was no obstacle, we had climbed plenty of them before. I was the first to go over, the metal warm and rough under my hands as I pulled myself up and swung my legs over. The others followed in quick succession, their movements practiced and efficient. Once we were all on the other side, we stood for a moment, taking in the scene before us. The woods felt alive, but not in the way that the creekside woods did, with their cheerful rustling of leaves and the soft babble of water. These woods thrummed with an energy that was deeper, older, and far less welcoming. The air here was cooler, carrying a faint metallic tang that seemed to settle on the tongue. The ground was littered with fallen leaves and branches, their edges brittle and sharp. We pressed on, drawn forward by a compulsion none of us could explain. The trees seemed to close in around us, their trunks forming walls that narrowed the path and funneled us deeper into the darkness. The shadow was nowhere to be seen, but its presence lingered, a faint but persistent weight at the edges of our vision. It felt as though the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. It was Toad who noticed the footprints first. They were faint, just impressions in the loose soil, but they were there, larger than any of ours, but not large enough to belong to an adult. The prints moved in a straight line, weaving through the trees in a way that suggested a deliberate path. We followed them, our steps careful and measured, the sound of our movements swallowed by the oppressive stillness. The footprints led us to a clearing, its edges ringed by trees so thick with moss that their bark seemed almost alive. In the center of the clearing stood an old, abandoned shed, its wooden walls warped and weathered with age. The roof sagged in places, and the door hung askew on its hinges. It looked as though it had been there for decades, forgotten by the world around it. The shadow was there, too, though I saw it only out of the corner of my eye, a fleeting, dark shape that seemed to dart into the shed the moment we arrived. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, but it also stirred something deeper, curiosity, tinged with the faintest thrill of fear. This was the kind of moment we lived for, the kind that turned ordinary summer days into stories we would tell for years. The others felt it too, I could tell. There was no need to speak, our unspoken bond carried us forward. We approached the shed with a mix of caution and anticipation, the air around us heavy with expectation. The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open, the sound startling in the stillness. Inside, the air was musty and stale, thick with the scent of rotting wood and damp earth. The interior was small and cluttered, filled with broken tools, rusted nails, and other remnants of a life-long past. A single beam of light filtered through a crack in the wall, illuminating a corner of the floor where the dirt had been disturbed. It was there that we found it, a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth with age. The book seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. I reached for it without thinking, my fingers brushing against the cool, supple leather. The moment I touched it, a strange sensation coursed through me, a mix of warmth and cold, like stepping into a sunlit room after being outside in the snow. It was disorienting but not unpleasant, and it left me with a sense of something just out of reach, like a word on the tip of my tongue. The others crowded around as I opened the book, its pages crackling softly with the weight of time. The writing inside was faint and spidery, the ink faded but still legible. It wasn't in any language I recognized, though the shapes of the letters seemed familiar in a way that was hard to explain. There were drawings, too, detailed sketches of strange symbols and maps that seemed to chart a place that didn't exist. The moment stretched, the world outside the shed falling away as we became absorbed in the book's contents. The pages seemed to draw us in, their strange, otherworldly markings weaving a spell that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. It was as though the book itself was alive, its secrets waiting to be uncovered. When we finally looked up, the light filtering through the crack in the wall had shifted, casting the shed in a dim, golden glow. The shadow was gone, but its presence lingered, a faint echo in the corners of the room. The book felt heavy in my hands, its weight a reminder of the questions it had awakened. We left the shed in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts as we made our way back through the woods. The book stayed with me, its mysteries clinging to my mind like the scent of damp earth. I knew, even then. The book stayed with me, both physically and in the recesses of my mind. It felt heavier than it had any right to be, as though the weight of its secrets pressed against my thoughts even when it lay untouched on my desk. I tried to focus on the ordinary rhythms of the days that followed, the sticky sweetness of melting popsicles, the hum of cicadas, the idle games we played on Sycamore Street, but the pull of the book was constant, a quiet insistence I could not ignore. At night, when the house was still and the faint murmur of the television in the living room drifted into my room, I would open it. The pages, fragile yet sturdy, whispered softly under my fingers. The strange script that filled them seemed alive in the dim glow of my bedside lamp, the curves and angles shifting subtly as though rearranging themselves into meaning just beyond my comprehension. The drawings fascinated me most, symbols arranged in patterns that felt deliberate, purposeful, yet defied all attempts at explanation. There were shapes that seemed to suggest maps, their lines twisting and spiraling in ways that hinted at places that couldn't possibly exist. It wasn't long before the others began asking about the book. Our little gang had a way of orbiting each other even when we weren't together, our interests and actions intertwining like the roots of the trees we so often explored. Jimmy was the first to press me about it, his curiosity thinly veiled by the nonchalance he always tried to maintain. Toad followed suit, his excitement less restrained, while Susie watched with a mix of intrigue and skepticism. Though I hadn't meant to keep it to myself, I realized that some part of me had hesitated to share it, as though the act of doing so might break whatever spell the book had cast. When I finally brought it to the sycamore tree, its presence changed the atmosphere of our gathering place. It rested on the grass between us like an artifact unearthed from some forgotten civilization, its cracked leather cover seeming out of place against the familiar backdrop of our street. We sat in a loose circle around it, the usual chatter and laughter replaced by a silence thick with anticipation. One by one, we turned its pages, our fingers leaving faint smudges on the fragile paper. Each of us saw something different in its contents. Jimmy was drawn to the maps, tracing their twisting paths with his finger as though he might stumble upon the meaning hidden within their curves. Toad fixated on the symbols, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to match them to anything he'd ever seen in his comic books or school textbooks. Susie, always practical, approached the book with a mixture of fascination and wariness, her focus shifting between the text and the drawings as though weighing their significance. It was Susie who noticed the recurring mark, a small, crescent-shaped symbol that appeared on several pages, always at the margins, as though it were a signature or a signpost. The sight of it stirred something in me, a vague memory of seeing it somewhere before, though I couldn't place where. We pored over the pages again, searching for clues, but the book offered no explanations, only more questions. The days began to revolve around the book. We would gather under the sycamore tree or in the shaded corner of someone's backyard, poring over its pages as though we could will its secrets into the open. The maps became the focus of our attention, their winding paths and cryptic symbols sparking endless speculation. Some part of us believed, or perhaps hoped, that they were more than just drawings, that they pointed to something real, something hidden just beyond the edges of our world. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the street, Jimmy proposed we test our theory. If the maps were real, he reasoned, then they should lead somewhere. We chose one of the maps that seemed the most straightforward, its lines forming a series of loops and intersections that suggested a path through familiar territory. The crescent-shaped symbol appeared at its edge, as though marking a beginning, or an end. Our exploration began with a sense of excitement tempered by uncertainty. The path on the map led us first to the creek, its winding course mirroring the twists of the drawn lines. From there, we followed a series of turns and markers that felt almost too coincidental to dismiss, a broken tree limb here, a pile of stones there, each one aligning perfectly with the map's instructions. It felt as though the book were guiding us, its creator reaching across time to pull us along this hidden path. The farther we went, the more the world around us seemed to change. The familiar woods behind Sycamore Street gave way to a landscape that felt wilder, more untamed. The trees here were older, their roots sprawling across the ground like veins. The air grew cooler, carrying a faint, metallic tang that pricked at the edges of our awareness. It was as though we had crossed into a place that existed just outside the boundaries of the ordinary. The path ended abruptly at a small, overgrown clearing. At its center stood an ancient stone structure, weathered by time and covered in moss. It was small, no larger than a tool shed, but its presence was commanding. The stone was dark and smooth, its surface etched with symbols that mirrored those in the book. The crescent-shaped mark was there as well, carved prominently above the doorway, which hung open at an angle. We approached slowly, the weight of discovery pressing down on us. The doorway yawned open like the mouth of a cave, its darkness impenetrable even in the bright afternoon light. The air around it felt heavier, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand on end. There was no question of turning back, we were compelled forward, drawn by the same force that had guided us to the shed in the woods. Inside, the air was cooler still, and the scent of damp stone filled our noses. The interior was bare, save for a pedestal at its center. On it rested an object wrapped in cloth, its shape indistinct but its presence undeniable. As I reached out to uncover it, my hand trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense that we were standing on the threshold of something far greater than ourselves. The cloth fell away, revealing a small, intricately carved box. Its surface was covered in the same symbols that adorned the stone structure and the pages of the book, their lines sharp and precise. The crescent-shaped mark was etched into the lid, its presence commanding yet subtle. The box was cool to the touch, its weight solid in my hands. We carried it back to Sycamore Street in silence, the gravity of what we had found settling over us like a heavy cloak. That evening, as the streetlights flickered on and the fireflies began their nightly dance, we gathered under the sycamore tree once more. The box rested between us, its secrets waiting to be revealed. The box sat in the center of our circle, resting on the grass under the shade of the sycamore tree, as if the very earth cradled it. It felt strange to see it there, out of the dark stone structure where we'd found it, bathed now in the ordinary light of our world. Its surface seemed to absorb the golden afternoon rays, the etched symbols faintly glinting in a way that seemed almost alive. None of us dared touch it again, not yet. There was something about its presence that demanded a kind of reverence, as though we had stumbled upon something meant to remain hidden. The air was thick with anticipation. Around us, the world carried on as usual. Mrs. Henderson's dog barked lazily at a passing squirrel, a lawnmower hummed faintly in the distance, and the cicadas droned in their endless song. Yet, to us, all of it felt distant, muted. The box had changed something. It was as though the weight of the discovery had pulled us into a different current, one that ran beneath the surface of ordinary life, invisible to everyone else. I was the first to reach for it, though my hands hesitated as they hovered above its surface. The carvings were intricate, each line and curve so precise that they seemed beyond the capabilities of human hands. The crescent-shaped mark at the center of the lid drew my eyes, its simplicity contrasting with the complexity of the designs that surrounded it. I could feel its coolness before I even touched it, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep from within. When I finally lifted the lid, the hinges creaked softly, the sound oddly sharp in the quiet air. Inside, the box was lined with a material that looked like velvet but shimmered faintly in the sunlight, its surface a deep, inky black. Resting within was an object wrapped in thin, brittle paper that crackled as I unfolded it. The sound made the others lean in closer, their breath held as though even the act of exhaling might disturb whatever lay within. The object was a disc, smooth and round, carved from a material that defied easy description. It was dark, almost black, but it caught the light in a way that made it seem alive with faint, shifting colors, deep blues, purples, and greens that shimmered just beneath its surface. The symbols from the book were etched into the disc, their lines so fine that they seemed to float above the material rather than being carved into it. The crescent mark was there as well, positioned at the center like the hub of a wheel. Holding it in my hands, I felt a strange sensation, as though the disc were humming faintly, its vibrations too subtle to be heard but strong enough to be felt. It was not unpleasant, but it was disorienting, like the first moment of stepping onto a boat and feeling the water shift beneath you. I passed it to Jimmy, who took it with the same cautious reverence, his expression a mixture of awe and trepidation. One by one, we each held it, our fingers tracing its smooth edges and faintly glowing carvings. The disc became the focus of our days. It was clear that it was tied to the book and the maps, though how or why remained a mystery. We pored over the book again, searching for clues in its pages, hoping to find some mention of the box or the disc or the crescent-shaped mark. The symbols began to take on a kind of familiarity, their shapes no longer entirely foreign, though their meaning continued to elude us. There were moments when the disc seemed to respond to us. When we held it in our hands, the faint humming would grow stronger, as though it were attuning itself to our presence. Once, as the sun dipped low and the golden light of evening bathed the street, the disc emitted a brief, faint glow, its surface pulsing with a soft, blue light. It was enough to send a thrill through us, a confirmation that the object was not inert, that it held some power waiting to be understood. The more we studied the disc, the more the ordinary world around us seemed to fade. Our games became less frequent, the idle hours spent riding bikes or skipping stones replaced by quiet, intense discussions under the sycamore tree. Even the creek, once our favorite haunt, was left unexplored, its waters forgotten in favor of the mysteries contained within the box and book. The weight of discovery was both exhilarating and consuming, pulling us deeper into a world we barely understood. It was during one of these long afternoons that Susie noticed something about the disc that none of us had seen before. The crescent-shaped mark, so prominent and central, was not simply carved into the surface, it was part of a mechanism. With a gentle twist, she was able to rotate it, the motion smooth and precise, as though the disc had been waiting for that exact movement. As the crescent turned, the carvings on the disc's surface began to shift, their lines rearranging themselves into a new pattern. The moment felt electric. The air seemed to hum with the same energy as the disc, the faint vibration running through the ground beneath us. We leaned in closer, our eyes fixed on the shifting symbols, trying to decipher their meaning. The new pattern was more intricate than the first, its lines forming what looked like a constellation or a map. At its center was a new mark, a star, sharp and angular, glowing faintly against the dark surface. The discovery set off a new wave of speculation. If the crescent-shaped mark could rotate, then perhaps there were other configurations, other patterns waiting to be revealed. We spent hours experimenting, twisting the crescent to different positions, each turn revealing a new arrangement of symbols. Each configuration seemed to hold its own meaning, its own secret, though none of us could decipher what they were. One evening, as the last light of day faded into twilight, we stumbled upon a pattern that felt different from the others. The lines on the disc formed a spiral, their edges glowing faintly with a pale, green light. As the pattern settled into place, the humming grew stronger, the vibrations coursing through the disc and into the ground. It was as though the earth itself was responding, its pulse syncing with the rhythm of the disc. We sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. The disc, the book, the box, they had led us to this, though to what end we could not yet say. It was clear, however, that we were standing at the threshold of something far larger than ourselves, something that stretched beyond the edges of Sycamore Street and the ordinary lives we had known. That night, as I lay in bed with the sound of cicadas filling the air outside my window, I couldn't stop thinking about the spiral. It felt like a doorway, a key to something that had been waiting for us to find it. Sleep came slowly, my mind restless with the possibilities of what lay ahead. The next day would take us deeper still, into a mystery that would change everything. The morning after we discovered the spiral felt different, though I couldn't say exactly why. The air seemed heavier, as though the world itself was aware of what we had found and was holding its breath in anticipation of what would come next. Even the ordinary sounds of Sycamore Street, the distant buzz of a lawnmower, the occasional bark of a dog, seemed muted, their presence overshadowed by the quiet pull of the mystery that had consumed us. The disc remained with me, tucked carefully into the same weathered box where we had first found it. I felt its weight even when it wasn't in my hands, as though its presence had seeped into my very bones. It wasn't just the object itself, but what it represented, a connection to something vast and unknowable, something that stretched beyond the edges of our little world. Under the sycamore tree, we gathered again, our circle tight and our voices low. The spiral pattern on the disc had captivated us, its glow lingering in our minds like an afterimage burned into our vision. We turned it over and over in our hands, tracing the lines with our fingers, searching for meaning in its intricate design. The faint hum of the disc seemed stronger now, a constant presence that resonated in the air around us. It was Jimmy who suggested we return to the woods, though the thought had been brewing in all of our minds. The disc felt like a map, its spiral a guide to something hidden within the tangled trees and overgrown paths. We packed it carefully into the box, securing it with the brittle paper in which it had been wrapped, and set off once more toward the edge of the neighborhood where the familiar woods waited. The path we took felt different this time, though it was one we had walked countless times before. The trees seemed taller, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out the sun and cast the ground in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The air grew cooler as we ventured deeper, carrying with it that faint metallic tang that had become familiar in the days since we first found the book. The disc led us, though it gave no clear instructions. We held it before us like a compass, its hum seeming to change subtly with each step we took. At times, it felt stronger, pulling us toward one direction or another, at others, it quieted, as though urging us to stop and consider where we were. The spiral seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, its lines glowing with an almost imperceptible energy. It was Toad who noticed the first marker, a small, crescent-shaped carving etched into the bark of a tree. It was faint, weathered with age, but unmistakable. The sight of it sent a thrill through us, a confirmation that we were on the right path. We pressed on, our steps quickening, the tension in the air mounting with every marker we found. Each one was different, symbols etched into stone, the arrangement of branches that seemed too deliberate to be natural, a faint impression in the dirt that mirrored the patterns on the disc. The markers led us to a clearing, smaller and more secluded than the one where we had found the box. At its center stood a large stone slab, its surface smooth and unbroken save for a single groove that spiraled inward, forming the same pattern as the disc. The air around it felt charged, alive with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The humming of the disc grew louder, its vibrations resonating through the box as though it recognized the slab and was calling to it. We approached slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on us like a heavy fog. The slab felt ancient, its surface cool and solid beneath my fingers as I traced the spiral groove. The disc seemed to tremble faintly in its box, its hum growing sharper, almost impatient. Without speaking, I removed it, the smooth, dark surface warm in my hands as though it had absorbed the energy of the clearing. Placing the disc into the groove was an act that felt both inevitable and monumental. It slid into place with a satisfying click, the symbols on its surface aligning perfectly with the markings on the slab. For a moment, nothing happened. The air was still, the world holding its breath as though waiting for something to unfold. Then, slowly, the spiral began to turn. The disc moved on its own, the faint glow of its lines growing brighter as it rotated. The hum grew louder, resonating through the ground beneath us, and the air seemed to vibrate with a low, rhythmic pulse. The symbols on the disc rearranged themselves with each turn, forming patterns that shifted and flowed like water. As the motion reached its peak, the slab began to emit a faint light, its edges glowing with the same ethereal colors that shimmered on the disc's surface. The light spread outward, casting the clearing in a soft, otherworldly glow. The trees around us seemed to fade into the background, their forms blurred and indistinct, as though the clearing itself had been lifted out of the world and into another place entirely. In the center of the slab, where the spiral ended, a new symbol appeared, a star, sharp and angular, glowing with an intensity that seemed to pulse in time with the hum. The disc stopped moving, the glow fading to a faint shimmer, but the star remained, its light steady and unwavering. There was a sense of completion in the air, as though the slab had fulfilled its purpose and was now waiting for us to take the next step. None of us moved at first, our breath caught in our throats as we tried to process what we had seen. The hum of the disc had quieted, its vibrations soft but present, a reminder of the energy that still pulsed through the clearing. I felt an unspoken question hanging in the air, one that none of us dared to voice. What had we unlocked? The walk back to Sycamore Street was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The disc, now cool and inert, rested once more in its box, its mysteries deepened rather than solved. The clearing felt far away, though its energy lingered, a faint hum that seemed to echo in the back of my mind. That night, as I lay in bed, the memory of the spiral and the glowing star played over and over in my mind. The clearing, the markers, the disc, they had been waiting for us, guiding us towards something larger than we could understand. The weight of it pressed down on me, mingling with the thrill of discovery, leaving me suspended between awe and unease. Tomorrow, I knew, we would return. There was no turning back now. The next morning dawned gray and cool, the kind of weather that made the world feel heavy and subdued. The usual sounds of Sycamore Street were muted under the weight of the overcast sky, the chirping of birds and hum of distant lawnmowers replaced by an eerie quiet. I woke early, the images of the glowing spiral and the star still vivid in my mind, their details etched into my thoughts like carvings in stone. The hum of the disc lingered, not in the air but in my memory, a faint vibration that seemed to reverberate through my chest whenever I thought about it. We gathered again under the sycamore tree, each of us carrying the weight of the previous day's discoveries. The disc sat in its box, the brittle paper cradling it like an artifact unearthed from some long-lost civilization. The light breeze stirred the leaves above us, their rustling like whispers in a language we couldn't understand. None of us spoke as we prepared to return to the clearing, our unspoken thoughts aligning as though carried on the same current. The walk to the woods was longer this time, or at least it felt that way. The path that had once been so familiar now seemed foreign, its twists and turns charged with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The trees leaned in closer, their gnarled branches twisting overhead like the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral. The air grew cooler as we pressed deeper, carrying with it that faint metallic tang that seemed to mark the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary. When we reached the clearing, the air felt different, thicker, more charged, as though the space itself were alive. The stone slab in the center was exactly as we had left it, its spiral groove empty now but still glowing faintly at its edges. The symbols carved into its surface seemed sharper in the dim light, their lines more deliberate, as though they had shifted overnight to become something new. We placed the disc into the groove again, its smooth surface fitting perfectly into the spiral as though it belonged there. The moment it clicked into place, the hum returned, faint at first but growing steadily stronger. The spiral began to turn, its motion fluid and precise, the glow of its lines spreading outward like ripples in a pond. The air around us vibrated with a low, rhythmic pulse, the sound resonating through the ground and into our bones. This time, something more happened. As the spiral completed its rotation, the star at its center flared to life, its glow brighter than before. The light pulsed in time with the hum, growing in intensity until it filled the clearing with an otherworldly brilliance. The trees at the edges of the clearing seemed to blur and fade, their forms dissolving into the light until they were no longer visible. At the center of the slab, where the star burned brightest, the stone began to shift. A seam appeared along its surface, splitting the slab in two with a sound like grinding stone. The pieces moved apart slowly, revealing a dark void beneath them, a doorway, its edges glowing faintly with the same shimmering colors that danced across the disk. The hum grew louder as the doorway opened fully, the air around it charged with an energy that made my skin tingle. The void beyond the doorway was impenetrable, its darkness absolute, yet it seemed to beckon us, pulling at something deep within. The clearing felt distant now, its familiar edges swallowed by the light and the vibrations that filled the air. The world as we knew it seemed to hang in suspension, replaced by this singular moment, this threshold that had been waiting for us. We approached the doorway together, our steps slow and deliberate, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. The disk, still resting in the spiral groove, pulsed faintly, its lines rearranging themselves once more into a pattern that seemed to mirror the doorway's edges. It felt alive, connected to whatever lay beyond, its energy resonating with the air around us. Standing at the edge of the doorway, I felt a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. The darkness beyond was complete, yet it held a promise of something larger than anything we could comprehend. It was a doorway not just to another place, but to another reality, one that had been hidden beneath the surface of our own, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Crossing the threshold was not a decision, it was an inevitability. One by one, we stepped into the void, the light of the clearing fading behind us as the darkness enveloped us. The air grew colder, and the hum of the disk intensified, vibrating through the space around us like the sound of a distant storm. There was no sense of movement, no feeling of ground beneath our feet, yet we pressed forward, guided by the pull of the doorway. The transition was gradual, the darkness giving way to a faint, diffuse light that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. Shapes began to emerge, shadowy outlines that grew sharper as the light brightened. We found ourselves standing in a vast chamber, its walls and ceiling stretching far beyond the limits of the clearing we had left behind. The chamber was unlike anything I had ever seen. Its walls were smooth and seamless, their surfaces glowing faintly with the same shifting colors as the disk. The floor beneath our feet was cool and solid, its surface etched with intricate patterns that mirrored those in the book. The air was filled with a soft, pulsing hum, the vibrations resonating through the chamber like the rhythm of a heartbeat. At the center of the chamber stood a structure that defied explanation, a massive, spiraling column that rose from the floor and disappeared into the distant ceiling. Its surface was alive with light and motion, the symbols etched into it shifting and rearranging themselves in an endless dance. The column pulsed with energy, its glow casting the chamber in shades of blue and green that seemed to ripple like waves. As we stood there, transfixed by the sight before us, the column began to shift. Its spirals unwound slowly, the lines of light and motion spreading outward like the petals of a flower. The air grew warmer, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The chamber seemed to vibrate with a deeper resonance, as though the structure at its center were awakening. And then, as the spirals reached their full extension, a new light emerged, brighter, sharper, more focused than any we had seen before. It radiated from the center of the column, its intensity cutting through the chamber like a blade. The light carried with it a sense of purpose, a clarity that seemed to pierce through the fog of the unknown and settle directly into my thoughts. This was it, I realized. The culmination of everything the disk, the book, and the clearing had been guiding us toward. Whatever lay within this light, it held the answers we had been searching for, the purpose behind the markings, the patterns, the pull that had drawn us to this place. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were only at the beginning. The light that radiated from the spiraling column was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just visible, it seemed to reach out and touch every part of me, seeping into my skin, filling the air, and vibrating deep within my chest. It was both warm and cold, both soothing and unsettling, a paradox that made it impossible to turn away. The others stood motionless beside me, their faces bathed in its glow, their expressions caught between awe and trepidation. The chamber itself felt alive. The walls pulsed faintly with light, their shifting colors rippling outward from the central column like waves on a pond. The patterns etched into the floor seemed to rearrange themselves subtly, their lines flowing together and pulling apart in a rhythm that matched the steady hum that filled the air. It was as though the space were responding to us, adjusting itself to our presence in ways we couldn't fully comprehend. We stood there, rooted in place, as the spiraling column began to move. Its light grew brighter, sharpening into distinct beams that stretched outward and connected with the chamber walls, tracing new patterns across their surface. The symbols carved into the column itself shifted with each movement, their lines rearranging into forms that felt deliberate, as though they were trying to communicate something just beyond our understanding. And then, as if in response to some unseen command, the column began to open. The spirals that had once encased its core unfurled slowly, their edges glowing with a soft, golden light. The movement was precise, almost graceful, and carried a sense of inevitability, as though it had been waiting for this moment to arrive. As the spirals widened, they revealed a hollow center, and within it, suspended in the air, was an object. The object was both familiar and alien, a sphere roughly the size of a basketball that seemed to hover effortlessly, its surface alive with shifting patterns of light. It was dark and smooth, like the disk, but its glow was far more intense, the colors swirling and blending in a way that defied logic. The symbols etched into its surface were similar to those we had seen in the book and on the disk, but they moved constantly, their forms reshaping themselves as though they were alive. The sphere pulsed faintly, its rhythm matching the hum that filled the chamber. As it turned slowly in the air, I felt a strange sensation, as though it were watching us, observing us in ways that went far beyond sight. It wasn't menacing or threatening, it simply existed, its presence overwhelming in its magnitude, yet oddly comforting. Without thinking, I took a step closer. The air around the sphere grew warmer, its energy washing over me in waves that made the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. I reached out, my hand trembling as it moved toward the glowing surface. The others didn't stop me, they stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the sphere, their breaths shallow and uneven. The moment my fingers brushed its surface, everything changed. The light in the chamber flared, bright enough to blind, though it didn't hurt. Instead, it seemed to expand, enveloping everything, filling every corner of the space with its brilliance. The hum that had been present since we first entered the chamber grew louder, resonating through my entire body, until it felt as though I were part of it, part of the light, the sound, the patterns that shifted and flowed around me. The sphere's surface grew warmer under my touch, and the shifting symbols began to slow, their chaotic dance settling into something more deliberate. One by one, they arranged themselves into a pattern that felt familiar, though I couldn't place why. The crescent-shaped mark appeared first, glowing faintly at the center of the sphere. Around it, the other symbols fell into place, forming concentric circles that radiated outward like ripples on a pond. Images flooded my mind, not memories, not exactly, but fragments of something larger, glimpses of places and times that felt impossibly far away yet intimately connected to the moment. I saw vast, sprawling landscapes bathed in golden light, their skies filled with swirling patterns that mirrored those on the sphere. I saw structures that defied the laws of physics, their forms shifting and flowing like living organisms. I saw people, or beings that resembled people, their faces indistinct but their presence unmistakable, moving through these spaces with a sense of purpose I couldn't begin to grasp. And then I saw the sphere itself, cradled in hands that were not mine, being carried through a darkened corridor lined with symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. There was a sense of urgency in the movements of the one who carried it, a sense of desperation, as though they were fleeing from something or towards something. The image blurred and shifted, the hands placing the sphere into the spiraling column before everything dissolved into light once more. When the light finally receded, I found myself back in the chamber, the sphere still hovering before me, its surface cool and smooth beneath my hand. The others were staring at me, their expressions a mixture of concern and awe. The hum in the chamber had quieted, its intensity fading to a faint vibration that lingered at the edges of perception. The sphere had changed. Its surface no longer shimmered with shifting colors, instead, it glowed with a soft, steady light, its symbols locked into the pattern I had seen. The crescent-shaped mark at its center pulsed faintly, a steady rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. I stepped back, my hand falling away from the sphere as it continued to hover in place. The chamber felt different now, its energy subdued, as though the act of touching the sphere had drained it of some vital force. The column, too, had stopped moving, its spirals frozen in their unfurled state, the lines of light that had connected it to the walls now dim and faint. The sphere remained, its glow casting soft shadows across the chamber floor. It was clear that it was waiting, for what, I couldn't say. But I knew, deep in my bones, that it had given us something. The images that had flooded my mind were not random, they were pieces of a puzzle, fragments of a story that stretched across time and space, connecting us to something far larger than we could comprehend. As we left the chamber, the sphere's glow lingered in my mind, its light a constant presence that refused to fade. The path back to Sycamore Street felt longer this time, the weight of what we had seen pressing down on us with every step. The ordinary world felt distant, its colors muted, its sounds faint and hollow. The sphere had changed us, in ways we were only beginning to understand. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the images played over and over in my mind. The landscapes, the beings, the spiraling column, they felt like pieces of a story that was still being written, a story that we had been pulled into without warning or explanation. The crescent-shaped mark glowed faintly in my thoughts, its presence a reminder that the journey was far from over. There was no turning back now. The days following our discovery of the sphere blurred together in a haze of restless energy and quiet contemplation. It was impossible to focus on anything else. The sphere's glow had imprinted itself into my mind, a constant presence that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep within me, even when I wasn't near it. I could still feel the hum of its energy, faint but insistent, a rhythm that pulsed in time with my heartbeat. It was as if the sphere had become a part of me, or perhaps I had become a part of it. The others felt it too. Jimmy, always the boldest among us, seemed quieter now, his confidence tempered by a weight he didn't fully understand. Toad, who usually filled every silence with his boundless enthusiasm, had grown introspective, his gaze often drifting toward the horizon as though searching for something just out of reach. Even Susie, the most grounded of us all, had a distant look in her eyes, as though she were trying to piece together a puzzle that only she could see. We no longer gathered under the sycamore tree for idle games or lazy conversations. Instead, our meetings were charged with purpose, our discussions centered entirely on the sphere, the chamber, and the images I had seen when I touched its surface. The book, which had once felt like the key to everything, now seemed small and incomplete in comparison. Its pages no longer offered answers, only questions that grew larger with each passing day. The sphere remained in the chamber, its glow steady and unchanging, as though it were waiting for something. We returned to it often, drawn by a pull we couldn't explain, but it gave no further clues. The spiraling column remained still, its light dim, the chamber quiet save for the faint hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. It felt as though we were on the edge of something immense, but the next step eluded us, hidden behind a veil we could not yet pierce. It was Susie who finally noticed the change. One afternoon, as the sunlight filtered weakly through a sky heavy with clouds, we stood in the chamber, staring at the sphere as we had so many times before. Susie's gaze drifted to the walls, her sharp eyes scanning the shifting patterns of light and shadow. Her brow furrowed as she stepped closer, her movements deliberate and cautious. The symbols on the walls had changed. Where once they had flowed and shifted with the rhythm of the chamber's hum, they were now fixed, their lines sharp and defined. They formed a map, or something like a map, a network of paths and connections that spread outward in all directions. At the center of it all was the sphere, represented as a glowing crescent mark surrounded by concentric circles. The discovery electrified us. The map was unlike anything we had seen before, its complexity staggering. It seemed to stretch far beyond the boundaries of the chamber, its lines extending outward into places we couldn't begin to comprehend. There were markers scattered across the map, each one glowing faintly with a light that pulsed in time with the sphere's hum. Some of the markers were clustered close to the center, while others were scattered at the edges, their positions seemingly random. We studied the map for hours, tracing its lines with our fingers, trying to decipher its meaning. The patterns felt familiar in the way that dreams sometimes do, just on the edge of understanding, yet always slipping away when we tried to grasp them. The markers seemed to correspond to something, though what that was remained a mystery. Some of them bore symbols we recognized from the book and the disc, while others were entirely new, their shapes alien and unknowable. It was Toad who noticed the first connection. One of the markers, glowing faintly near the center of the map, was shaped like the old sycamore tree on our street. Its twisted branches were unmistakable, their pattern mirrored exactly in the glowing lines on the wall. The realization sent a chill through me. The map wasn't just a representation of the chamber, it extended into our world, its lines tracing a connection between the ordinary and the extraordinary. The discovery opened a floodgate. One by one, we began to identify other markers, each one tied to a place we knew. The creek, the alley where we had first seen the shadow, the clearing where we had found the box, all of them were represented on the map, their positions marked by faintly glowing symbols. It was as though the map had been woven into the fabric of our lives, its paths overlapping with the places that had shaped us. And yet, there were markers we didn't recognize, their shapes and positions entirely foreign. They were scattered across the outer edges of the map, their glow fainter than the others, as though they were farther away, or perhaps more deeply hidden. These markers fascinated and unnerved us in equal measure. They felt like invitations, beckoning us toward places we couldn't yet see. The realization that the map extended into our world changed everything. The sphere, the chamber, the disc, they were no longer isolated mysteries. They were part of something larger, something that connected us to the world in ways we had never imagined. The weight of that connection pressed down on us, its implications both thrilling and terrifying. The following days were spent exploring the map. Each marker we visited revealed something new, a fragment of a pattern, a hint of a larger story. At the creek, we found another carving, this one hidden beneath the roots of an old oak tree. It bore the same crescent mark as the disc and the sphere, its edges faintly glowing in the dim light of the woods. In the alley, we discovered a faint impression in the ground, its shape matching one of the symbols from the book. Each discovery deepened the mystery, pulling us further into its orbit. But it was the sycamore tree that held the greatest surprise. Beneath its sprawling roots, hidden by years of dirt and leaves, we found a small, metal box. It was old and rusted, its hinges creaking loudly as we pried it open. Inside was a fragment of something, a shard of the same dark, shimmering material as the sphere. Its surface was etched with symbols, their lines glowing faintly in the afternoon light. The shard hummed softly in my hands, its vibrations resonating with a frequency that felt familiar. It was a piece of something larger, something that had been broken and scattered, its fragments waiting to be found. The discovery filled me with a sense of purpose, a certainty that we were on the right path. The shard was a key, just as the disc had been, and it would lead us to the next piece of the puzzle. That night, as I lay in bed, the shard resting on my desk, I felt the weight of the journey pressing down on me. The connections we had uncovered, the paths we had followed, the places we had found, they were all part of something larger, something that stretched beyond the boundaries of our understanding. The map on the chamber walls was more than a guide. It was a thread, pulling us toward a truth that had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to find it. The sphere's glow lingered in my mind, its light a reminder that the journey was far from over. The shard we found beneath the sycamore tree marked the beginning of the end, though at the time, we could not have known just how much it would change everything. Its smooth, dark surface hummed faintly, as though it carried within it the echoes of the sphere's power, its energy familiar yet distinct. Holding it in my hands, I felt the same pull I had when I first touched the sphere, a quiet insistence that urged me forward, that whispered of a larger design waiting to be uncovered. The shard was a fragment of something larger, that much was clear. Its edges were jagged, as though it had been broken from a greater whole, its symbols incomplete and unaligned. It wasn't until we returned to the chamber, the shard carefully wrapped in cloth and carried like a sacred relic, that we understood its purpose. The spiraling column at the center of the chamber remained still, its glow faint and subdued, but the moment we brought the shard near, its hum intensified. The air in the chamber seemed to shift, the patterns on the walls glowing brighter, their lines rearranging themselves in response to the shard's presence. The map that had so captivated us now pulsed with a steady rhythm, its symbols sharper and more defined. The shard fit perfectly into a recess at the base of the column, its jagged edges aligning seamlessly with the grooves etched into the stone. The moment it clicked into place, the column flared to life, its spirals beginning to move once more, their light spilling outward in waves that filled the chamber. The hum deepened, its vibrations resonating through the ground and into our bones, and the sphere, still suspended within the column, began to glow with renewed intensity. The patterns on the walls expanded, their lines stretching outward into new configurations, their complexity growing with each passing moment. The map, once confined to the familiar places we had explored, now extended far beyond the boundaries of our world. It showed landscapes that defied description, their forms shifting and flowing like living things. It showed structures that hovered above the ground, their surfaces shimmering with light. And at its edges, where the lines became faint and indistinct, it showed pathways that seemed to dissolve into nothingness. The shard had unlocked something, a new layer of the map, a deeper understanding of the connections that bound the chamber to the world around us. The markers we had visited, the carvings we had found, the paths we had followed, they were part of a network, a web of places and energies that spanned across time and space. The sphere was the center of it all, its glow steady and unwavering, its crescent mark a beacon that called to the fragments scattered across the map. The days that followed were consumed by the search for more fragments. The map on the walls had changed, its symbols shifting to highlight new markers, new places where the shards might be hidden. Each marker glowed faintly, its light pulsing in time with the sphere's hum, as though it were waiting for us to find it. The markers closest to the center of the map were familiar, places we had visited countless times, their significance now made clear. We found the second shard at the creek, buried beneath a tangle of roots that had grown around it like protective arms. It was smaller than the first, its surface smooth and unbroken, its symbols faint but unmistakable. The moment we placed it into the column, the chamber responded, its spirals moving faster, its light growing brighter. The map expanded again, revealing new layers, new connections that stretched even farther into the unknown. The third shard was harder to find. Its marker led us to an overgrown lot on the edge of town, a place we had always avoided for reasons we couldn't explain. The lot was empty, its ground uneven and littered with debris, but at its center, hidden beneath a patch of moss, we found the shard. It was different from the others, its edges sharper, its hum more insistent, as though it had been waiting longer to be found. With each shard we placed into the column, the chamber grew more alive, its energy stronger, its light more vibrant. The spiraling column moved with a precision that seemed almost sentient, its motions deliberate and purposeful. The sphere remained at its center, its glow constant, its symbols shifting in ways that seemed to mirror the changes in the chamber. The final shard was the most elusive. Its marker was faint, its position at the very edge of the map, where the lines blurred into obscurity. It led us deep into the woods, beyond the clearing where we had first found the box, to a place that felt untouched by time. The trees here were ancient, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their roots stretching across the ground like veins. The air was heavy, carrying a stillness that pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. We found the shard beneath a stone cairn, its placement deliberate, as though it had been hidden there by someone who knew its importance. The moment I touched it, the hum that had followed us since we first entered the chamber grew louder, vibrating through the air with an intensity that made my ears ring. The shard's surface glowed faintly, its symbols bright and sharp, as though it were alive with energy. The walk back to the chamber felt longer than ever, the weight of the final shard pressing down on us with every step. The air seemed charged with anticipation, the hum growing louder as we neared the clearing. The spiraling column flared to life the moment we entered, its light spilling outward in waves that illuminated every corner of the chamber. When we placed the final shard into the column, the chamber transformed. The spirals unwound completely, their light filling the space with a brilliance that made it impossible to see. The sphere began to move, its glow intensifying, its symbols shifting into a pattern that seemed final, complete. The hum grew to a crescendo, vibrating through the ground, the air, and my very bones. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The chamber fell silent, its light dimming to a soft glow. The spiraling column returned to its original position, its motion ceasing, its energy contained. At its center, the sphere hovered, its surface smooth and dark, its crescent mark glowing faintly. The map on the walls had changed again, its lines rearranging into a new pattern that stretched farther than I could comprehend. It was clear that something had been unlocked, though what it was, we could not yet say. The shards, the sphere, the chamber, they were pieces of a puzzle that had only begun to reveal itself. The map was no longer a guide. It was a doorway, a connection to something vast and infinite, something that waited for us beyond the boundaries of our world. As we stood there, bathed in the soft glow of the chamber, I felt a sense of completion, but also a beginning. The mystery that had consumed us for so long had opened a path, and though the journey ahead was uncertain, I knew we would follow it. The sphere, the map, the connections that bound them to us, they were no longer separate from us. They were a part of who we were, and who we would become. The veil had lifted, and the truth waited beyond.